welcome. I'm joined by Matt Hussey of Generosity X. So he's going to be talking all about end of year email campaign tactics and strategies. So I want to pass it off to him in just a second, but just to sort of let everyone know, we will be sending out the slide deck and the recording after the webinar. So keep a lookout in your inbox for that tomorrow morning. And then obviously feel free to drop any questions or comments in the chat as we go along. And if you see a question in the chat and you actually have an answer to it based on something you've seen work for you, feel free to kind of spitball ideas in the chat with each other, because this is also a space that we want to sort of provide for you all to interact as peers. So definitely respond to each other and ask all the questions you have. And yeah, with all of that, I will pass it off to you, Matt, to introduce your organization and kick it off with the content.
Cool. Well, thanks so much. It's good to be here. It feels a little kind of wild to be here after just, I know there's some Canadians, the Canada Post strike, Giving Tuesday. So I was feeling the pinch, and to be totally honest, a little kind of almost scared coming into this, but it's great to see good attendance. And I'm actually really excited, kind of coming off even yesterday. There's some things that were even learnings for me. So I'm excited to dive into it. For those who don't know me, or what is Generosity X, who's this Matt guy? Well, obviously I'm Canadian, but I am the founder and lead strategist of a digital and direct response fundraising agency called Generosity X. We're based in Calgary, Alberta, right near Banff, Alberta, beautiful Canadian Rocky Mountains. And we're kind of a boutique-sized organization. We're a team of 10, are coming up on 10. And we work with charities all across Canada and North America. So lots of clients in the US, helping them grow their fundraising program at the mass level. So how do you get more and more people to give to your organization, not at maybe the $50 million level, but the $50 level, and how to build a sustainable annual giving fundraising program that scales. So that's a little bit about me. Our full legal name is Generosity Experience Corporation. And I get really, really excited about this idea that when somebody gives their money away with nothing in return, there's a moment to be had there. I know Tim Sarantonio from Neon One, a CRM for kind of small to mid-sized organizations, talks a lot about that. And there's this great book called The Power of Moments that talks about how we often think of moments as, you meet somebody, a meet cute, the rom-coms. Obviously, we're in the season of the holidays, so a lot of Hallmark movies out at the moment, where we sort of think about these sorts of moments. Obviously, I'm kind of romanticizing it a little bit, but any sort of moment. And we think that they have to be left up to chance, or that we don't really have control over them. And the interesting thing about this book, and kind of the premise behind Generosity X, is actually those moments can be orchestrated. We can plan and help create more of those moments for people. And that's what I get really excited about, is how to use marketing to create moments like that for donors. And email can be a huge part of that. Hence why we focus on it. And I guess more of our kind of ethos, and then I promise we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of things, is this idea of teach first. A lot of times agencies, and this is where actually I've had a lot of value alignment with Feathr, they sort of, gatekeep information or practices or information from their clients. They think, well, if we tell you how to do this, or if you know how to do this, that makes us pointless. I actually think that's a very scarcity mindset. And I know kind of Feathr thinks that way as well, is actually the more information and resources that people have available to them, the better their tools work for them, first and foremost. That actually just means that that organization will have more potential. So we try to be very open and candid and clear with what we learn and what we know, because if we want to make, as an organization, Generosity X, the biggest difference on philanthropy, fundraising, and generosity really around the world, that means we should be generous ourselves and share that as widely and freely as possible. So hopefully everything I shared today, there's no sort of, oh, well, you need to work with us, or any sort of that sort of kind of language where it feels gatekept. If you listen to this webinar and you're able to implement some of these ideas yourself, that's a win in my book. So hopefully making this really accessible, really practical, and getting down to the mess of it. And yeah, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about what we do, we really focus on kind of the continuum of a donor experience. So how that donor is acquired. We do a lot of focus around donor acquisition, both digitally and via other means like direct mail. how to renew and keep those donors. Retention is such a big theme in the fundraising space, knowing we have a huge problem when it comes to retention. And then cultivation, how to find more monthly donors from that pool of individuals, how to get more donors giving at higher levels, how to engage with those donors via things like surveys to possibly find planned gifts. So that's just a little bit about us. What we're going to be talking about today, and hopefully focusing more on you, is kind of what are some ways how to think about growth, to just give some context ahead of that. The meat and potatoes, we'll probably spend 40 minutes going through ways you can improve your email performance. And then we'll hopefully have 15 to 10 minutes at the end just for some Q&A. I know some people might have a hard stop at the top of the hour, so just making sure we don't go over time and you can get all the information you need. And hopefully if you have a question, be able to ask it as well. So with that being said, let's do it. So I just want to talk about growth. I'm a big fan of this this kind of marketing behavioral, I guess, scientist named Daniel Pink. He wrote a really famous book called Drive around how to motivate employees. And we're not going to be talking about HR or motivations inside of our organizations per se today, but just motivation in general is going to be a big part of kind of a lot of what we're talking about today, and the ways in which we, as people within our organizations, ought to be thinking about growth. And he talks about the candle problem. I think it's like a sort of one of those famous, if you've heard of I forget what it's called, but some of those sort of riddles that are quite common. They're maybe framed off game shows. He talks about the candle problem, where they show an image like this, and they go, okay, you have a candle, some thumbtacks, some matches, and you have to light this candle without letting the wax drip on the table. And they talk about this idea that, how would you go about doing that? And people kind of share some ideas. They think through some problems. And a problem like this, they eventually do share one proposed solution. Well, empty the box of thumbtacks and put it up on the wall. But when the problem's presented like this, it doesn't feel very clear what the answer is. It's a very conceptual problem. There might be a lot of solutions to go about it. Whereas if you present the problem like this, it might feel a little bit more black and white. But he talks a lot about this idea of conceptual problem solving as sort of like the new era or age we're in. We talk a lot about the industrial age or the information age, where it's very, the desired outcome is very clear and predefined. It's almost as if you were building a desk from IKEA. There's only one real correct way to go about doing that. Whereas how do we grow the revenue of our organizations? There's a lot of answers to that question. Actually, that's a very unique problem to solve, because the solutions for it can be a myriad of different things. And that's actually, I think, an important topic or just theme to kind of remember throughout this, is we're going to be talking through one particular framework in which you can think about your fundraising. And we're going to be sharing some very practical ideas. But the important thing to know is none of these solutions are silver bullets. Giving Tuesday, right? We were talking about that. Giving Tuesday isn't a silver bullet. It's not necessarily a one size fits all, but hopefully you can grab onto some of these things that you feel like fit within the context of your organization and use that to find solutions in ways in which you can grow your fundraising revenue. So one model we're going to be just kind of using to help give some context to our discussion is this LIFT model. It was developed by a CRO agency in Vancouver called Wider Funnel. They've since been known as Conversion CRO agency. Really interesting organization. They work with some of the biggest companies in the world. So the Microsofts, the Universal Studios of the world. And they talk about how do you drive your value proposition to increase conversion. So they're really focused on how do we get, from a web point of view in particular, how do we get more people coming to our website to complete the desired action? And the value proposition is what we're trying to drive. If I want to go to Universal Studios, that ticket's got to be valuable to me. But there's things we can do around it to make it more, to strengthen the likelihood that somebody would convert. So one is urgency. How do we use urgency so that people know this value proposition is relevant to me right now, or that there's a reason to take action today, right? We talk a lot about that in the fundraising space, is the value and importance of urgency. And then there's two things we can focus on and two things to hopefully fight against. So one is how do we bring more clarity to donors that when they give, their gift matters, and relevance to donors. When they give, it has the sort of impact that they're looking for. This is relevant to you if you're searching to make an impact in these sorts of ways. Um, and then the last thing is, how can we decrease distractions? As humans, we're more easily distracted than we ever have in our lives. Our attention span is lower than it ever has been in the history of humanity, as far as I understand it, which is makes our job harder because we have to make things very relevant very quickly. And anxiety, that might not be the right word. I would put it as confusion. So I feel nervous about this. If I were to make a donation online, is it safe and secure? Especially if you think of, the average donor is 65 years old. There might be more kind of fear, uncertainty, confusion, especially with digital and email. There's a lot of, unfortunately, spam, scams out in the email marketing space. So how can we make it feel more trustworthy and less anxiety inducing? All in support of our value proposition. So the one thing we're not going to talk about today is how to make your organization more valuable, because if you're doing charitable work, it probably is extremely valuable. But what are the ways we can support the value proposition and strengthen it to lead to more conversions? And we'll talk about all of that in the context of email. So just a general housekeeping note, we're going to have time for questions at the end. If you have any questions along the way, throw it in the chat. We might not get to it right away, but we will have some time to go through the end. We're just going to try to keep track of those questions. And then, of course, if you want to talk in the chat, that's fantastic. Yeah, and then making sure if there's anything that does feel more clear, we'll be able to, or unclear, we'll be able to kind of jump through the slides just to make sure we clarify any points so you feel well equipped and hopefully get some value out of today. So number one, speaking of CRO, website-based A/B testing, and just testing in general, if you want to improve your email marketing, both now and in the future, one great thing to do is don't assume you have all the answers. So everything I'm going to be talking about today, these are things we've seen success with and that seem to be working with other organizations, but there's no silver bullet. So how do you know what works for you? Focusing on testing. I'm going to be talking about A/B testing in particular. But if you're a smaller organization, if you don't think you really have a relevant sample size to do A/B testing, or maybe your tools don't support it, or if you just feel a little unsure about it, you can also just think about testing as trying new things, trying to find the answers to see if things work within your context. And experimentation or testing is a growth tool. It's a strategy to help us increase confidence in decision making. So how can we create the best user experience for donors? How can we use and make decisions based off what we're actually seeing from controlled experiments? If we think of true A/B testing that way, and helps us as an organization focus on growth. So there might be lots of people who have lots of different opinions when it comes to fundraising. The great thing about testing is it helps us know with certainty and speak to things with a little bit more confidence within our organizations. We should say this, not that. We should not send more emails because it won't work, or we shouldn't focus on email. Well, let's test and find out. And the cool thing about testing is it can have a huge impact. So let's say this is I'm going to, for this first part, actually not talk about email, funny enough, because we're going to be sharing a whole lot more email suggestions throughout. But just kind of the value of testing and then using that within email. And the reason why not to include any email A/B tests is that might distract from the point on testing of its own. Is if you do a test and it causes a loss, well, then you can quickly pivot and go back to the usual plan, right? Oh, geez, that didn't work. So testing allows us to mitigate bad decisions. And if we see a win, that's great. And maybe we see a really big win. And the cool thing is if we test around things that have a lasting impact, it's like maybe we design and make our emails look different in a certain way, and we see that continually works for us. Or if we think about our website, maybe we change something on the website and we see that improves conversion rate. The amazing thing around testing, from my point of view, is that you allow cumulative impact. So if we see that we did something and improved things 25%, the amazing thing is like, great, let's start doing more of that. Let's roll it out if it's a web-based A/B test or an ad. And if it was a 25% lift, now we've actually broken our chart, which is just fantastic, because this actually can have a very big lasting impact. This was for an organization doing $1 million online. You find one test with a 25% lift, and that can increase things by nearly $250,000 before the end of the year. So testing matters, and you actually can do small things to make a big difference. So this one organization, they didn't update their website around kind of different campaigns. They started doing that. We actually ran an A/B test. It lifted revenue online by 25 or 34%. So small thing. Yeah, it seems like a good idea. It probably would make a difference. Would it make a 34% lift difference? I actually didn't even think so. I just thought it would be a good thing. Let's actually test and see how it works. And FAQ, can we bring more clarity to donors or reduce anxiety? FAQ, and this is a great thing actually to include in emails as well, but just that idea of a simple test just at the bottom of a homepage in the footer, something as small and simple as that can increase donations by 11%. So just kind of knowing that testing small things can make a huge impact. What if we just added a little heart and made it a flutter? It might be hard to see here, but it's an animation that increased the amount of traffic we were driving to a sponsorship checkout flow by 69%. So small things. And again, we're not going to talk too much about web here on out. This was just to kind of more emphasize the value of testing. The cool thing about testing is it allows us, one, to see the impact of things so that we can use that within our organizations to make smart decisions for our organizations. And two, it allows us to also just kind of know for sure whether something works or not. The one thing I don't have in these slides is all the tests that haven't gone. Testing most of the time when we do it only works about a third of the time. Most of the time, it makes no difference at all. And actually 15% of the time, our tests actually had a negative impact. So we have to use that to mitigate against that decision. But the more value of it is we get a learning and a finding and clarity around actually what works for our organization. So if you're not planning to test or try anything new or just be a little lean into experimentation, at least a little bit over the next 4 weeks, that's one small thing that you can do today, no doubt. It's just like, well, is there anything we'd want to maybe see for sure is going to make a difference? Are we making a decision around how our emails are going to be sent out this year? And should we actually be testing it to make sure it's a good decision? Is there anything we really want to try, but we're hesitant because we don't know if it works, that we could actually run a test and see if it actually would make a difference? So just knowing testing brings clarity. And then first and foremost, it means we can better find solutions. So to go back to the idea of that, some of the solutions we're trying to solve for aren't black or white. They're conceptual problems that have many different solutions that we can go about. Yeah, and this is just a helpful chart just talking about it. We do a lot of things. I talked about this more than half the tests we do, or about 50%, I should say, don't make any impact at all. We thought it was a good idea, and it just, it was this, that, tomato, tomato. And when we test, it allows us to mitigate bad decisions. Ooh, that actually had a loss. Let's make sure we don't keep doing that. Good thing we tested it first so that we can mitigate it. And then when we do a bigger A/B test, it allows us to find the stuff that really works and see the really big impacts. So testing, and that's a great note to keep in mind with all of this. It's like, these aren't silver bullets. I don't know for sure they would work for every single organization we'd ever work for, but they give you some ideas, some things you can probably test out for yourself. Send emails. This sounds silly, but a lot of people go, donors hate emails. When we send an email, people complain. We ran a really interesting experiment last year. It wasn't a one-off email test. It actually was a really big test where for the entire month of December, they had their usual approach that they were going to do. That was the control. And I said, hey, why don't we split your donor file and email file in half? They had a mix of donors and subscribers, like prospects, in their email file. And let's run a test to see if one approach is better than the other. So it wasn't one small thing that was different between the two. It was actually a pretty big difference. And the three primary things was, one, we sent more emails. We actually leaned into that. We were like, this is not nearly enough emails. They had one per week through the month of December. And we said, actually, we need to be doing more emails, both by segmentation, more versions, especially for mid-level. That was a really important group to this organization. But then also just frequency of just, there's a lot of noise in the month of December, not just in the charitable sense, but I'm getting emails from Wayfair. I'm getting texts from Wayfair. I had to put my phone on do not disturb for this. IKEA, there's every organization and business as well who does any sort of e-commerce or retail work is in the biggest season of the year for them. And we just said there was a lot of noise. You probably need to lean into your email more so. And I'll talk about the fact that not all the emails were asked kind of when we get to tip 7. We did some more variations in look and feel of emails. We had a mix of design. We did more plain text type emails. And then the third was we also just, what was the last thing? Sorry. Oh, yes, we just leaned into the types of emails. So they weren't all design versus plain text, but then there were also different types of offers. Some were thank you. We just said email isn't a bad thing, treating donors like ATMs. So what if we can make stronger relationships? And the cool thing is this was the revenue by the groups. It was about a 120% lift in revenue. We saw a similar lift in number of gifts. So it wasn't just a big donor that created the double. But this organization didn't really just care about revenue coming through email alone. One, they cared about, did it actually increase overall revenue? And the interesting thing is, yes, it did. So we split the group, and of course, email revenue went up because we sent a whole lot more emails. But this was actually just a good thing for the organization at large. And this organization had a pretty heavy direct mail program. They were definitely direct mail first. But it actually also led to a statistically significant increase in revenue per donor just in general in the last month. So it actually, email not only affected the amount of gifts coming through email as you would expect it would, right? If you start doing more of something, you'll probably make that more weighted if you think about it from like a pie chart point of view. But it also made just the pie bigger. So they just made more money from the test group than they did from the control. So email, the frequency and the number of emails also had a positive influence on just the revenue and the health of the organization and their fundraising results. And what I find most interesting about this is often we go, well, donors are going to be really upset. They're going to get annoyed. Unsubscribe rate actually decreased over time. So as people got more and more communication from the organization, they became less likely to unsubscribe, not more. It wasn't like by the third email, now I'm really annoyed, I'm going to unsubscribe. The amount of people actually decreased, and the likelihood that they would decrease or unsubscribe as time went on actually decreased. So that was all great to see. And where that sort of trends and feeds into is they actually had some big impacts on retention rate. M&R Benchmarks does M&R. I actually don't know the name of the agency, but there's a report every year called the M&R Benchmark Study. And they talk a lot about, they used to, in 2019 and previous years, they used to talk a lot about the impact on retention rate and the correlation between email frequency. So more organizations that were sending more emails had a statistically significant, not by a huge portion, but positive influence on their retention. Like when you sent more emails, it not only led to more revenue, but it also led to more, the likelihood a donor would be retained, which of course makes sense because if they give, then you just secured them, you retained them. But we talk a lot about retention rate and just the fact that there's a crisis going on around how low retention rate is within our industry. And what was cool is it improved retention across the board, but for two groups, it had a very big impact. One, new donors. When we increased the frequency of emails at year end, a new donor was more likely to make a second gift who had been acquired earlier that year. That's really important because new donors, of course, are the hardest group or typically have the lowest retention rate out of most donors within a pool. They're not loyal yet. They've only given a gift. They didn't give to you. They gave to a cause, right? They don't really maybe have an affinity towards you yet. And what's great is we can see there was an increase in conversion rate, and this was statistically significant, about 92%, looking at it from a Bayesian point of view. If you're a statistician, you'll know what that means. If not, you just need to know it was statistically relevant. There was a 92% probability it was the better version. That gives us a lot of confidence. If we were surgeons, that might be too low, but as marketers, fundraisers, if we see that the likelihood that something works is 92%, that's probably good rationale to trust it, knowing the stakes are usually low. It's not like anybody's dying from this. So the science of it varies a little bit. If we were rocket scientists, we'd want 99.99% confidence. But what's cool is, speaking of that level of confidence, is donors who gave in 2022. This was a big test we ran last December, but then hadn't yet given in 2023. What was the likelihood they would give before the year was done, or they were at risk of churning? So if you've heard of Labunti, last year, but unfortunately not this year, as what that acronym stands for. I don't know who invented it, but Labunti, so it kind of rolls off the tongue pretty well. Those donors were also far more likely not to churn. So we talk about retention and the fact that we're losing donors. And when this organization increased frequency, again, not all fundraising asks, but when they just communicated more with donors and were willing to, they actually had, this is where we get that really, really high statistical significance of 99.99%. And it improved it from the benchmark of 60%. So the email frequency, maybe summarize this point, obviously impacted email revenue positively, as you would probably expect. Yeah, you sent more emails, so you got more email revenue, but it also impacted just revenue across the board. The organization was better off from sending more email frequencies at large, and it actually positively influenced retention rate, specifically with the donor groups that I think matter a whole lot. New donors, getting them to give that second gift is so critical if we want them to be retained long term. And then, of course, donors at risk of churning. That Labunte group, we're about to lose them. And if we lose them, then of course they become far, far more less likely to give the following year. So it's important to get them to give year in and year out to help them increase and maintain a healthy retention rate. So emails does not equal a bad thing. Not only can it impact your revenue, it can also impact your retention rate. Because if you want to be keeping more donors, even if you have all the money in the world, I know that's not the case for most, if any, organization. It's also important just knowing email has a positive role to play, in my opinion, on retention. So don't be afraid to send emails. That's number two. Number three, we're going to move a little bit quickly here. Those were the two sort of big points, is ditch the design. So a lot of people only send design emails. Some organizations only send plain text emails. Again, not to say one is better than the other per se, but we see a lot of success with plain text emails for our clients. In this example, this was for a big summer campaign. They had they were running a hospital or kind of medical center in Yemen. And if anybody is familiar what's happening in Yemen, it's a country that's been in a lot of conflict the last 9 years, I believe, or maybe past decade, and for a variety of different reasons. So we won't go into that per se. They were running a medical center that they had grant and government funding for through Global Affairs Canada, and that funding sort of dried up. It stopped, and this organization was in a very serious pinch where all of a sudden they needed to start raising a lot more money so they could fund the hospital themselves, or people's lives would be at risk. It was a campaign with a lot of stakes. It wasn't around a new emergency the same way, obviously, maybe what's happening in Gaza or Lebanon, in Israel, and just some of those things around some. It wasn't a new crisis. It wasn't a new like earthquake, or if we think the hurricane that went through North Carolina. This has been something that had been going on for a while, but they had a new reason and an emergency crisis-like campaign to fundraise around. And what's interesting is this was actually the fourth email in the campaign. So it wasn't the first one. But they eventually kind of sent an email that was a little bit more almost like a plea, a cry for help. And we tested it. So we said, okay, we're going to create one version where we have the typical email header above where this control thing is. If you actually saw the email, it would have the organization's logo. They'd kind of have some information down below. And then they tested that against a plain text email. The text was the exact same. And actually, this version had an image to kind of support the kind of design email. And this one had a lift of 300%. It did have an increase in average gift, but also the number of gifts was also statistically significant. But people just gave a little bit more, which I think when you think of an email like this, if you think of what are we fundraising around this year end, maybe we're an organization in Canada and the Canada Post strike is causing a crisis amongst and within our organization. We're going to run a massive deficit this year. There's sort of this crisis going on. While designed email, not to say it's a bad thing in every context, but if you're thinking about ways we can communicate an authentic from the desk of this sort of serious, sort of seldom tone, plain text email can actually be a very effective way to sort of reach those groups and speak to that crisis-like language. And that's kind of what we saw here. So if all your emails are designed this year end, there's a reason to maybe strip some back or to test an idea like this. I would also say if you only ever do plain text emails because you've seen other data like this, I know Next Afters, who's a partner of ours, and we're a partner of theirs as well. They talk a lot about plain text emails and the value of it. They've done a lot of testing there, but just kind of knowing there's still maybe value to testing it yourself, especially if you've just kind of only done plain text emails. We've been doing that for a while. Maybe let's try designed email. If you've only ever done designed emails, this is a low-hanging fruit. I haven't seen a lot of tests where a plain text email actually does far worse, or where it's at least doesn't do on par or just as well as a designed email, especially when that's the majority of a cadence a donor sees or an email subscriber sees. So that is that. I'm just going to take a sip of water here, and we're going to talk about email automations. Great. This is going to be kind of a weird analogy. But there's these I don't even know how to pronounce it. Havanas, or that's definitely not right. But these flip-flops I buy every summer. Um, they're great. I love summer. I love just kind of being barefoot and or in flip-flops and just enjoying the warm weather. And what's interesting is if I was this organization's marketer, and I was kind of asking my team, how should we market this to our donors? When should we market these flip-flops? Most of us would say, oh, we should do it in the spring because that's when people are probably going to start buying their flip-flops. And we take a similar approach in fundraising oftentimes is, oh, it's Christmas or it's the year end or it's the holiday season. And you know, we should be promoting, we should be fundraising. Hence why this kind of webinar is so relevant and timely is if you don't have all your plans for year end or if you still have time to tweaks, what's at stake right now is pretty significant. We know a lot of people are going to be making donations this time of year. And that's a macro decision. We know at large this season, this time of year is going to be relevant to a lot of people. We're in a shared experience, and the same way summer is a shared experience, at least in the Northern Hemisphere in the months of July and August. And then, of course, the Southern Hemisphere for January, February. Um, but there's also a reason to focus on automation, which focuses more on the micro. As a donor made a decision, they did something, their behavior, and we should capitalize off that. So sort of there's going to be people who this one is relevant to the seasonality, but it's specific to the donor. So if somebody starts a checkout flow and doesn't complete, we follow up with them. And not all email marketing tools make this easy. This is one reason why we do like Feathr for a number of our clients because it makes doing these sort of behavioral type send emails versus a single send type email quite easy. So just knowing there's also going to be times when donors behave in a certain way, and how do we sort of capitalize off that moment? They behaved in a certain way. It's specific to them, not all donors. But we can use automation, we can use behavioral type marketing to reach them so that we kind of speak to them in a very specific way. So this one's kind of a kind of mirage or a mirroring of a abandoned cart type email. We don't use that type of language because fundraising is a very different transaction experience, in my opinion, compared to purchasing something online. Even the word cart in fundraising is kind of an irk to me. But just sort of this idea of like, hey, you started something, we noticed you didn't finish, and we just want to let you know that this is what your donation, if you were still considering making a gift, this is what your donation can do. Versus the single send is kind of this macro, right? Okay, it's Christmas, it's year end, it's the last day of the year, there's an emergency, there's a match offer now. This is kind of these macros. And in my opinion, these have to go hand in hand. It's not one's better than the other. I think that'd be ridiculous to say, don't bother sending any mass year-end emails this year. But just knowing technology is making it easier and easier for any one of us to get personalized content, right? So if you sent me an email that said, dear friend, that has been the floor for so long that I would say, come on, you don't know my name. I'm going to be less likely to engage with it. And it's also even more true that that is the kind of bare minimum these days. That's actually not personalization. That's just including my first name. Or it might not feel like a personalized experience, yet personalized marketing based off people's behaviors, that is becoming more and more apparent and easier for other organizations or businesses to engage with us. So it's just becoming more and more what we're expecting out there when we get an email. I expect it to be specific to my interests, needs, behaviors, likes, values, and just knowing there needs to be kind of a coupling of both of these. When if we only send single send, we miss out on opportunities to engage with donors in very specific behavior-based ways. And when we only engage with donors that way, we miss out on the opportunity of sort of the collective sum, something happening to everybody at large that we can capitalize off of, and that's going to be relevant at large. So seasonality kind of speaks to the macro, and automation speaks to the micro. And a great example of this is along with kind of a abandoned cart. It's also donor anniversary. If you lots of email marketing tools like Feathr will give you the opportunity to include custom fields, so you can insert a field like donor's first gift, and then you could base an email so it's sent every year on that donor's anniversary. There's going to be some donors in your file who have given for 10 years straight or 5 years, and these kind of really significant milestones. and how can you sort of capitalize off that opportunity? Again, it's a good strategy, but on an individual basis, it applies to a donor one by one, right? You can't just send happy anniversary to all our donors. Of course, that wouldn't feel relevant. But email automation, it allows us to take advantage of these behaviors, our donors' specific interests, needs, behaviors, while also just making sure we also capitalize off end of year loans. So don't forget only to focus on single sends, but making sure if there's ways you can build in email automations, drip campaigns, behavioral based sends, that's also critical. And it goes hand in hand with making your end successful, let alone the rest of the year as well. 5, this is an easy one. If a lot of the things I'm talking about right now, you're like, whoa, we don't have time for that. We're way too busy. We have most of our plan. I was kind of looking for some little easy nuggets. This is one. Resends. So the sad truth is when we send an email, this is an average. So you might have an amazing open rate. But on average, only 30% of people who get emails open. Obviously, now there's Apple iOS, more technology, and or kind of privacy and into softwares, and the technology we have is making this a little bit less reliable. But for conversation's sake, when we send an email, not everybody opens it, and actually the majority of people don't. Usually, when we send an email, it's only the minority of people who open it, which is a shame. It means we spent all this time working on an email, and it has a very low shelf life, and it also has a very low uh, sort of like saturation into our total list. So one thing we focus a lot on is how do we make sure that we just send an email to people who didn't open the first one, and this allows you to make your emails, give them more shelf life, and it also allows you to recognize for the people who are opening all your emails, you might not want to keep hammering them, pardon me, with an email one after another, because of course they've been opening all of them. But for those who aren't opening them or didn't open them, especially when you have a big offer, it's the last day of the year to give. This week only, your gift can be matched. We have a really important stewardship email that we think will really connect donors with our organization. Making sure you use resend gives your emails a longer shelf. So we sent an email in the morning, 30% of people opened it. Maybe we'll send it the next day or later this week in the afternoon. We'll try a different time. Maybe we'll send it a Saturday afternoon because we sent the first email Thursday at 7 a.m. Eastern time, first thing in the morning. And a resend is super easy to do. You just kind of find the email and then resend it to people who did not open that first email. Typically, we'll also recommend you create a new subject line, so it acts as a new thread. And you also just try something a little bit different, because if somebody didn't open the email the first time, it might not have had anything to do with the subject line, but there is a chance that some people at least would have been not as interested with whatever the subject line would be. So we'll usually try pretty radically different. One might be, if we think of Giving Tuesday or the last gift of the day of the year, it's the last day to give of 2024. For some people, especially our most engaged donors and subscribers, they might open that and go, great. That's kind of what I was looking for. I was ready to give and I was really interested. But then, of course, there's people who are getting a whole bunch of those emails. I got lots going on. It's a busy day. I'm planning for my New Year's Eve party. Wait, what's happening? And even just sending an email in the afternoon, there's still a little bit of time as a subject line, might invoke a little bit more curiosity and might perk some interest. And it might allow you to kind of make use of that email from people who didn't actually open it. So email resends, tools like Feathr, make it easy just to kind of group donors who did not open an email for a particular campaign, so you can easily capitalize off this. And the great thing is, from a workload point of view, all you really need to do is set up that campaign and write one new subject line, and then you're done, because you can just take the email from before and give it a bit of a longer shelf life. 6, forwarded emails. Forwards are great, especially in the subject line when you include capital FWD and then colon, because Gmail is the biggest email platform on earth. The vast majority of us use email. I think it's 60%. Don't hold me to that number. I don't have a source in front of me. But that's the formatting in which Gmail uses when we forward emails. So if I forward an email to a friend, it'll come up as capital FWD colon. You can see here it's, I wish I did that in this email slide. This is cap locked. But the reason for that is then if we then design an email to look like a forward, one, this kind of mirrors that plain text look and feel. but it allows us to also make an email a little bit more apparent. So you can see the emails down below. Um, and then this forward just kind of says, hey, did you see our last email by chance? It's sent from an individual, or at least appears to be sent that way. So it feels very real and relevant. Um, and typically forwards have a very, very high open, especially when you use an FWD in the subject line, because typically if somebody's forwarding something to me, they're doing it because I might be interested in it. They thought of me when they decided to forward it. So this is also an effective way to just, again, take an email you had earlier in the week. This is typically what we'll do for maybe a second email. And yeah, just make that email strong and then just kind of use FWD and then the original subject line, because of course that is the subject line we're kind of trying to forward. So that's the email we're trying to forward. And just make it very relevant, casual. It feels very human-like communication. And of course, humans give to humans, right? We engage and care when we feel like there's a human element at the very least, especially in fundraising. That's an important trend. So this is a really easy way as well, is if you feel like you have a great email, especially a match, and you just felt like, well, we don't really have more to say than what was already included in that email, but we would like to follow up, send a reminder. This is a great way to include that original email. Format it like a forward. You can see here this was left aligned in my email inbox. Um, and yeah, this is just a great way to kind of give your emails a little bit more life as well and really help increase your open rates when you're in the middle of a big campaign without it having to create a whole lot more new content. You can see the copy here is pretty short and largely just reiterating what was down below. 7, match campaigns. I love match campaigns. It's been a big part of my career, is how to make really strong match campaigns, and particularly how to make a really strong digital match campaigns. So 1 week long match campaigns, um, all that sort of stuff. And what's interesting is match campaigns can be really effective all year round. You can see here, this yellow line kind of jumps around from the axis here. This is for a number of different organizations, each running a match campaign at a different time of year. And you can see, you know, for some campaigns done in April, right, it's represents well over 10% of their total online revenue. Some organizations run in November and December, and that represents a really big part of their revenue. But match campaigns can be great all year round. However, looking at this November one and December one, what's interesting is as a proportion of your total web revenue, this is when these campaigns can have big lifts. And how I view it is a match campaign will make, so long as it's executed well, will make a campaign better. I just firmly believe that, unless, of course, you're only doing match campaigns. And I also think match campaigns should be part of your annual strategy. When is our annual match campaign? How can we build off last year's success? It's a little late for this, but if you did feel like, well, we might have some donors who are going to be making some year-end gifts too soon, and there might be an appetite to offer a match to our mass donors. What's interesting is even if you make that campaign just 10% better, if you make the last week of the year 10% better, that can have huge impact. This is a very important month for a lot of organizations. And what we typically see is, regardless of when you run a match campaign, it can be a big and important part of your annual giving calendar. However, when you run a match campaign in the last 2 months or last 4 weeks of the year, that can just make that time of year a percentage wise better, which of course, from absolute dollars point of view, can make things a lot better because just the stakes at this time of year are significant. So for a lot of our organizations, they run Giving Tuesday campaigns, but then they also run match campaigns for those who don't really focus on Giving Tuesday or another time of year. The last week of the year, see a lot of success. What's interesting is we just did this for an organization yesterday. They had run a kind of match campaign, and compared to the year before, obviously this is a Canadian-based organization and the Canada Post strike, there's a lot of variables. This wasn't a controlled A/B experiment. However, they saw 500% year over year increase just from this campaign. Last year, they didn't have a match. This year, they did. And yeah, it's just kind of a note that if you feel like a match offer might be out there, including that in the last week of the year as kind of a match campaign, 1 week long, even if you don't have print components with it, I actually believe a digital only match can even make a match feel particularly strong, powerful, because it adds to the urgency. It adds to the now. It makes it feel as which people have to go online and make their gift there, which of course is the only way for them to take advantage of the offer. So just kind of knowing match campaigns, I think they're fantastic. And I also think in the last week of the year, this is where a small percentage point difference, 10, 20, 30% better, can have really big impact. And then last but not least, don't just ask. A lot of this is fundraising focused, and ultimately, I am a fundraiser. My goal for the organizations we serve and work with is to make them to grow their revenue. But for a lot of our organizations, we make sure that in the increase in frequency in emails, we also include times to engage with donors, thank donors, and let them know the ways in which their gift is making a difference. So that A/B test I mentioned earlier on, this idea of sending emails is a good thing. Not all those emails were asked. So we did increase the frequency, but some of the emails were something that looked like this. Just this idea that, hey, Christmas and New Year's is almost here. This was sent a few days before this organization kind of referenced Christmas in particular. And we just want to say thank you. We're not here to ask for money. And actually, what was interesting is this was also a forwarded email where down below they did include some information and a story they had received from one of their program workers to really make it feel authentic and unique. And I just had something very unique I wanted to share with you because you're just an amazing person supporting our organization. Some people would say, well, doing that at any time in the last 2 weeks of the year is risky. You shouldn't do anything but ask people for money. I actually think, or shouldn't distract people from that. Um, just send one or two emails only with asks. I actually think most people, when you bring value, have no reason to unsubscribe. So this idea of how can we make our emails valuable for a donor? One of the ways in which we can do that, of course, is giving can be life giving, but also just this idea of when we engage and share other ways in which a donor can feel involved, connected, and experience generosity. That's a way we can just capitalize off this moment so that people go, wow, giving to this organization felt incredible. So that hopefully they're ready to give again by the next time. So that could be within a 4-week window, right? We thanked, and that made our following email even stronger. But it also means you just build a stronger fundraising and donor relationship program in general. So, and that kind of speaks to this idea that fundraising is very unique, right? We're not fundraising or marketing to people based off the fact that they're hungry, the same way a McDonald's billboard ad off the side of the highway would. We're actually trying to help people be the best version of themselves and reach this higher identity, higher meaning for themselves. So just a note to finish on, this idea of these occasionally remarkable moments shouldn't be left up to chance. They should be planned for, invested in, and we all hold the power to create those types of moments for our donors. So with that being said, I'd said there'd be 10 minutes. There's only 9. So pardon me. We're going to open it up if you want to throw your questions in the chat. And then, yeah, I'll just maybe need some help to go through them. But thanks everybody for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks so much, Matt. That was great. Lots of really valuable strategic content there. And yeah, I wanted to kind of double down on one thing that you said. You were mentioning sort of the flip-flops example and talking about how for-profit companies do a lot of this. And I think heading into end of year especially, it makes sense to sort of take a page out of that book and pay attention to the way that retail companies get your attention in the holiday season. Because even though there's different goals involved, retail companies are incentivized to understand the behaviors of consumers, understand how to get in front of people in the right ways, get seen, get clicks, all of that. And so they know what works when it comes to driving conversions. And so I know that nonprofits obviously think of themselves as very different than for-profit companies, but when it comes to especially end of year, just kind of targeting the right people and getting people to click through to your site and make a donation, you are trying to drive a conversion just like for-profit companies are. And so sort of taking from their successes and seeing what works and trying to replicate that. So if you see something in your email inbox from a retail company that grabs your attention or you feel works, or, like I even love your example of the little heart on the button making actually a bigger difference than expected. It seems subtle, but kind of, engages people on like a visual, emotional level. And so I think those little things can go a long way, and just kind of paying attention to what you're seeing in your own experiences. What are you clicking on? What's grabbing your attention? And pulling some of that into your own nonprofit marketing.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah, so let's see what's going on in the chat here. So before we get into the actual chat, I know somebody used the Q&A just to ask earlier on how many different email campaigns people are running per month on average. So that's a question from Gareth. I don't know if you have sort of a take on that, Matt. I know a lot of the people that I talk to who use Feathr We'll run, a couple of email newsletters a month and then maybe a couple of email appeals. But like you were just saying too, I think it's really important to provide value, not just be asking for things. And so,
Yeah.
inviting people to events, sharing impact reports, things like that, in addition to making those asks is important. But what do you see sort of on a month-to-month basis in terms of email cadence?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I typically say engaging with your subscribers at least once a week with an email, not like a non-ask, but like just sort of any type of email. And then I personally think I'm a little bit maybe more bullish compared to the typical marketer, is I think people support organizations because they also just love what it does for them in terms of giving is a very positive experience. So I'd say half of those, I think it's appropriate for half of those to be solicitations or directly involved with a fundraising campaign, whether it's like a thank you kind of following a campaign. Um, so yeah, probably a similar cadence to what you're describing. End of the year, maybe kind of increasing it a little bit. I know a lot of organizations might send multiple emails in a given week. I think the key is making sure you have a good usual cadence and then using behavioral based emails to sort of couple that and speak to, so you have kind of a usual cadence and flows. And then when people behave in certain ways, we capitalize off that moment and don't just leave it to the single sense.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, I'm seeing from Amy in the chat, do you mock up the forwarded email or is it actually forwarded?
Good question. If I'm understanding you correctly, Amy, it's actually mocked up. So this was sent through an email marketing platform. We've done this with clients through like Feathr and other tools. So this is actually a mass marketing email that just looks very much, you can see the forwarded message, and we'll use merge field so that it goes Matt Hussey and then Matt at Generosity X. So we make it look very much like a forwarded email, but this is done at mass.
Cool. And then so the little heart that was on that button, Jessica's asking if that was through a fundraise up tool or how that was added.
Great question. We got the idea from Fundraise Up. Fundraise Up tested that. If you know Sal from the Fundraise Up team, he's a great friend of mine, really awesome guy. He told me about how they actually ran that as an A/B test. So shout out to Fundraise Up. They tested that before they launched it live, and this was a sponsorship checkout flow built very custom, not using any particular. Actually, it was entirely custom built. So we just said, hey, Funders Up's tested this. Let's try this out as well. Sponsorship was a big goal for this organization, so they wanted to give it additional weight. So we custom coded this, but it was inspired by Fundraise Up. So if you're ever wondered, is this hard dumb? Does it work? They've tested it, so have we, and it actually makes a difference at opening the checkout module or driving people to a particular page.
Cool. Um, Okay, real quick, before we get into, there's a couple more questions here, but before people start to jump off, I want to launch a quick little poll in here, just to kind of see if anyone's interested in getting a personalized walkthrough of Feathr. So as Matt mentioned, some of his clients use Feathr. He helps them leverage Feathr's email marketing and advertising tools to drive end of year giving and year-round giving, engage donors, all of that good stuff. So just wanted to launch this before people start hopping off to their next meetings and all of that. But yeah, if you're interested in getting sort of a more personalized walkthrough, seeing how Feathr could fit into your specific organization's needs coming up on end of year or heading into 2025, just drop a yes in the poll. And we'd love to connect with you. So I'll leave that running, and then we can kind of continue with the questions. So Jessica asked as a follow-up to the question about the heart, was it difficult to code that? So it's custom hard.
Great question. I don't think it was very hard to code, but it was a developer who did it. So I think they only spent maybe an hour coding it. So it was custom coded, and I wouldn't have been able to do it myself as somebody who knows a little bit of HTML, but wouldn't describe myself as a developer by any means. Not too hard. So if you have a dev you have on contractor or within your team, they'd be able to code something like this most likely, no problem.
Cool. And then, so Sarah asked for those plain text emails that you found, perform a little better than the designed ones. What do you have at the top? Is there any branding? Are you including a logo at the top? Things like that.
Great question, Sarah. No, it was completely and oh yeah, here we go. It was complete. This was the entire email. So we had a little unsubscribe, I think, at the bottom, just to say if you don't want to receive emails from me or the organization I'm with, something like that. There was kind of human-like unsubscribe and the general stuff, but no logo at the top. Very much a stripped back email.
Cool. Yeah, we definitely play around with that at Feather within our own marketing initiatives, where sometimes we'll sort of do more of a plain text style to kind of engage people on that level. And then sometimes it feels more appropriate to do more heavily designed email, but um, definitely just depends on the specific campaign and sort of what people have been seeing. Sometimes I think it's nice in an email sequence to kind of break things up and do some more designed ones and then a little bit more of the sort of personalized plain text look. So it's not all blending together. Um, and then, yeah, one last question it looks like from Christine. So for A/B testing, how many people would you say are needed for each group for the results to feel useful?
That's a great question. And I hate to do this, but it depends. There's amazing tools out there that help you determine what kind of sample size you need. So if you go onto Google and go sample size calculator for marketing A/B test, there'll be lots of free tools that come out. And CXL has one. So if you see one that's CXL, that's like a CRO newsletter learning kind of website. That being said, my personal view is some people are very firm on this. Oh, you shouldn't even bother A/B testing if you don't have a relevant sample size that's big enough. And it won't be as, of course, statistically relevant or statistically well done. Or if you think about it like a control experience experiment, the science and the kind of that's needed to kind of really call it a rigorous science experiment. Uh, you need a minimum sample size for that. But my personal view is most A/B tests that I do in my work and that you'd probably do in a context like this, they're not going to hurt anybody. They're not probably going to have huge drastic impacts. And if they do, good thing you tested it. So a lot of my view is, yep, see what kind of sample size you need to trust it completely. We run tests all the time where they don't reach statistical significance or, it only reaches 80% confidence, which most statisticians would say, that's not high enough to trust completely. For our purposes, 80% gives enough confidence that we can at least proceed with it and test it some more. But again, we're not surgeons, we're not rocket scientists, we're not going to do anything that's going to have huge negative impacts if it goes wrong. It's going to be more marketing focused. So continue to test and not necessarily believing everything is black and white. But I personally think there's not a lot of downside in this industry to run a test, other than the fact that you just need to know it's not going to be as rigorous in terms of the results or in terms of understanding the experimentation.
Awesome. Well, I think that is all the questions that we had in the chat. So thanks everyone for your engagement, for asking questions. Like I said, this will be sent out to you, so keep an eye out in your email inbox for the recording and the slide deck tomorrow morning. And thanks again, Matt, so much for all of the hard work you put into putting this presentation together and all of your insights. It's been really great to have you.
Yeah, absolutely. And no, and I'll just maybe because I'll just kind of say we have a lot of clients using Feathr and we're seeing amazing results. And all of these ideas, great technology. We're not in we have other technology implementation organizations we work with. That's not our role. But when you have great technology, boy, does it make life a whole lot easier. So I would just say if you're not a Feathr customer, we use lots of platforms, so we're kind of platform agnostic, but I'm happy to say, yeah, Feathr is a platform that we've seen a lot of our clients have seen really practical success. Same with like a fundraise up and others. So thanks for having me.